Part 12. Crossing the T, the end of the line. By 1914, other weapon systems were available which could even sink dreadnoughts, and might possibly bring the big gun era to an end. First came the underwater weapons, the mine and the torpedo. These weapons made the Royal Navy change its plans. Defensive minefields could be laid outside ports. Also, mine layers could drop them wherever they might sink passing ships. One of the latest dreadnoughts, HMS Audacious, sank after hitting a mine off the northern Irish coast. In 1914, German submarines firing torpedoes sank several British cruisers. Torpedo attacks could be made by torpedo boats and torpedo boat destroyers, also known as destroyers. Both sides laid traps in which submarines firing torpedoes would ambush the opposing battle fleet. This was part of the Imperial German Navy's plans which led to the Battle of Jutland. The British Grand Fleet was forewarned and easily avoided the German submarines. But later, the threat of a full-scale torpedo attack by German destroyers would make Admiral Jellicoe turn away just as his line of battle was pounding the leading ships of the German High Seas Fleet. Before the beginning of the First World War, the British had planned a naval blockade of Germany. Mines and torpedoes made a close blockade too dangerous, but smaller warships could enforce an effective blockade in the North Sea. This distant blockade would be backed up by the battle fleet if the Germans came out to drive away British patrols. Earlier in the war, it became clear that even the mighty battleships required escort from destroyers to protect them from attack by torpedo boats or submarines. Half the Royal Navy's destroyers were attached to the Grand Fleet. The British blockade deprived Germany of supplies, including food and war materials. The smaller German High Seas Fleet had to challenge its more numerous opponent, the British Grand Fleet. They tried to whittle down the Grand Fleet's advantage in numbers by catching smaller elements of it. At the end of May 1916, they tried to catch the British battlecruiser force. Their plan was to lure them into action against the Germans' first scouting group, their own battlecruisers. Then the main body of the German High Seas Fleet would arrive to finish them off. They succeeded in bringing about an action between the battlecruiser squadrons in parallel lines. The Germans seemed to be achieving their objective. Two of the British battlecruisers had blown up just as the main body of the High Seas Fleet was coming into action. Fortunately for the British, the 5th Battle Squadron, the latest oil-fired super-dreadnoughts, arrived in time to allow the remaining British battlecruisers to lead both the Germans' first scouting group and the main body of the German High Seas Fleet into the guns of the Grand Fleet. The Grand Fleet deployed superbly from their sailing formation of columns into line to cross the Germans' T. The 5th Battle Squadron was nearest the High Seas Fleet. A midshipman aboard HMS Barham, part of the 5th Battle Squadron, was wondering where the Grand Fleet was when, suddenly, out of the mist, almost melted into view Admiral Jellicoe's great battleships, ship after ship, 27 in all, firing their broadsides. They had well and truly crossed the Germans' T. Admiral Scheer, commander of the German High Seas Fleet, ordered a battle turn away. This was a simultaneous 180-degree turn by every ship in the German line. At the same time, his destroyers laid down a smokescreen and made torpedo attacks. As Churchill said, Jellicoe was the only man on either side who could have lost the war in an afternoon. The Grand Fleet turned away to avoid the torpedoes. A few minutes later, the High Seas Fleet was no longer visible from the Grand Fleet. The Grand Fleet resumed its course, but the High Seas Fleet reappeared and got hammered again until its large ships turned away individually, while its smaller ships again made smokescreens and torpedo attacks. The Grand Fleet had to turn away again. By the time it had reformed, contact was lost. After sunset, Admiral Jellicoe signalled the fleet to take night cruising order. This was close formation with his destroyer flotillas astern of the main battle fleet. Jellicoe set course for a position where he hoped to intercept the High Seas Fleet in the morning. Scheer steered towards the German defensive minefields and batteries around the Horns Reef. His course took the High Seas Fleet through the British destroyer flotillas, which fought back as the massive dreadnoughts broke through them. In the morning, Jellicoe had to give up the pursuit short of the German defensive minefields. The High Seas Fleet had escaped disaster and had inflicted heavier losses than their own, but the British had kept command of the sea. As an American journalist put it, the German fleet has assaulted its jailer, but is still in jail. British merchant ships were still safe from the threat of German warships. Germany remained under the British naval blockade. During the following winter of 1916, the blockade was so effective that the Germans called it the Turnip Winter or the Hunger Winter. In 1917, the Germans returned to unrestricted U-boat warfare. It would bring the Germans the closest they came to winning the war. And yet another new weapon system pointed to the coming eclipse of the big gun and the line of battle itself. At the beginning of the Battle of Jutland, a seaplane from the seaplane carrier HMS Engadine had spotted and reported the German scouting cruisers. This was one of the first steps towards the ultimate weapons system which would replace both battleship and line of battle, the aircraft carrier. Battleships would continue to be part of the projection of naval power, but effectively it was the end of the line. Battleships in World War II would be another story. Even in the First World War, victory at sea involved other weapons systems. Click on the link below to War at Sea 1914 to 1918 for the full story.